They are a stateless people, deprived of a national identity, and this has made them much more vulnerable than other minorities to all kinds of exploitation. Myanmar's Rohingya Muslims face persecution at home and neglect and abuse in countries they're forced to flee to. Who is responsible for the plight of the Rohingya? This is the debate.
They're known as nobody's people left in no man's land. The situation of the people of Rohingya, already living under harsh conditions in one of the poorest parts of the world, is worsening day by day. Myanmar's security forces reportedly kidnap Rohingya men and women and put them to forced labor in military bases. They also systematically rape and assault the women. Those who flee Myanmar to neighboring countries, including Thailand, in hope of a better future, face similar dangers. Muslim Rohingyas have no social status in Myanmar. According to the United Nations, the Rohingya Muslims living in Rakhine province are one of the world's most persecuted communities. Rakhine has been the homeland of the Rohingya people, distinguished by their language from the predominantly Buddhist people of Myanmar for hundreds of years. However, the government insists that they are not indigenous to Myanmar and have recently migrated there from the Indian subcontinent. Based on that claim, the regime denies the Muslim minority citizenship rights. Being stateless, the Rohingyas are facing terrible consequences, including the Rohingyas have no social status in the country. Since they are not allowed to have more than 2 children, more than 60,000 Rohingya children are effectively non-persons. Rohingya Muslims are not allowed to travel. They even have to obtain permission to go from one village to another and have to pay heavy bribes. The restriction severely limits their access to schools, work and market opportunities and health services. Rohingya Muslims have no means of accessing state hospitals or even social security. Diseases requiring intensive care or major surgery are treated in clinics lacking proper staff and equipment. Most diseases cannot be treated and drugs are very expensive. The situation of Rohingyas worsened in 2012 after clashes that broke out in Rakhine. Hundreds of the Muslims were killed and hundreds more forced to leave the country. Families who had lost all their possessions were forced to flee Myanmar in unseaworthy boats. Bangladesh soon closed its border and Thailand sent the boats back. Very few of the people aboard those boats reached land and the rest were left to die.
You're watching the debate. Let me introduce our guests for you. In Washington, Frederick Peterson, Congressional Defense Policy Advisor, and in Madison, Dr. Kevin Barrett, Muslim-Jewish-Christian Alliance. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. I'll put my first question to our guest in Washington, Mr. Peterson. The uncertain legal status of the Rohingya increases their vulnerability. And the question here is, what can be done about this problem?
Well, the situation there, as you have described it and as it is on the ground, is absolutely outrageous. It is a human tragedy. It is a human atrocity. There is not just religious but ethnic violence being perpetrated by the majority Buddhist environment against the minority communities there, not just the ones throughout Myanmar, actually. They are inflicted with the most dire consequences. They have had put upon them a statelessness, which they are people without papers, people without any standing, and for the world community to merely to actually ignore this, and the first African American president to actually be stepping up and saying nothing about this adds to the atrocity of the matter. These are people that greatly need attention and influence of the world community to come to their assistance and to provide them some human understanding and compassion and support. They are not getting it. This is truly an atrocity.
Well, let's bring in Dr. Kevin Barrett on this as well.
We also have,
yes.
In fact,
yes, if you'd allow us, Mr. Peterson, to bring in Dr. Barrett, and I'll be back with you. And now, Dr. Barrett, let's look at the law that right now Myanmar has. Based on the 1982 Citizenship Act, Myanmar's government does not recognize the Rohingya as citizens, and it deprives them of identification documents. So effectively, they have a stateless status. Now, this is being described as discriminatory. So when we are speaking of responsibility, who should be to blame for the situation that these people are facing? Do you think that it's not just the Buddhist majority, it's the government in itself, and also the reports that we're getting that it's the police and security forces who are carrying out systematic attacks against these people?
Well, that's right. This is not just some spontaneous populist set of riots from the Buddhists in Myanmar against the stateless Rohingyas. In fact, this is a case of state-sponsored genocide. It's a policy of the government, and it has been for a long time. Many people don't realize that in the 1970s and 1980s, as many as 200, or some say even 300,000 Muslims from Myanmar were ethnically cleansed and basically, forced to leave their country on this ridiculous, blatantly historically false premise that those people hadn't lived in that country for generations. In fact, there have been Islamic emirates and all kinds of Muslims all over Myanmar for probably 1,000 years. And certainly in the last several centuries, there's been a very powerful Muslim presence. But this genocidal myth has been developed, not so much by the people, the Buddhist people of Myanmar, but by their leadership and their government that says that these people don't belong there. It's a classic case of ethnically motivated scapegoating, and it's absolutely genocidal. The same thing that happened in Nazi Germany, the same thing that's happening now in Palestine is happening in Myanmar. Now, as far as who's responsible for this, I think we have to assign some responsibility not only to the government in Myanmar and to the Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who has defended this brutal genocide. A Nobel Peace Laureate defending genocide? This is outrageous. But also we have to blame the American government and the world community. Now, if we look back at when this latest wave of extreme persecution and genocide started, it was May of 2012. And less than 2 months later, the U.S. rewarded the Myanmar government for its genocide by sending its first ambassador in decades to Myanmar and opening up relations. And less than a month after that, in I believe August of 2012, Myanmar's government was rewarded for the genocide by an opening up U.S. trade with Myanmar and pouring investments into their oil industry. This is absolutely outrageous. It really looks as though the U.S. is encouraging, if not sponsoring, this genocide. I hope that's not the case. Yes. But to make it absolutely clear that it isn't, it's imperative that President Obama immediately impose sanctions on the government of Myanmar until the genocide ends.
Mr. Peterson, do you agree with that comment that it's very essential now for the United States to show a proper reaction rather than encouraging relations? And we're seeing a lot in the media also in the West that they're seeing the situation in Myanmar as a nation moving toward democracy and progress rather than a government that's ethnically cleansing a part of its population.
I could hardly agree more with your other guest. Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and President Obama, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, both are ignoring or endorsing, aiding and abetting one of the worst, most racist, brutal regimes on the face of the earth, and that is not an exaggeration. What is being done to these people as in an ethnic cleansing is a major world atrocity, and it is so sad, it is beyond sad, it is an outrage that the world community is not rising up to say, no, this will not stand. Instead, we have Peace Prize winners that are aiding and abetting this atrocity. It is a moral outrage. Your other guest is right on point. We are together, shoulder to shoulder on this. The NGOs throughout the world have been bringing attention to this, and yet major governments, for whatever reasons, it's a multiplicity of reasons actually, are either ignoring it or aiding and abetting this, and this needs to stop.
What kind of reasons are you referring to? Can you elaborate?
What kind of reasons?
Yeah, you said for some reasons these countries are encouraging this violence rather than condemning it. They have their reasons.
Yes, certainly. They have economic reasons. They have economic interests in the area. There just seems to be almost an inexplicable ignoring of the plight of a major people, and it is ethnic as well as religious. Here we have the Buddhist majority, often thought by people as being a passive religion, that is conducting an ethnic and a religious cleansing that is a moral outrage to people of all religions. This cannot stand. We should all, together, whatever differences we may have among us, recognize a moral outrage, call it by its true name, and do something about it. Action must be taken. These people need to have their status identified, and they need to have their status clearly defined, and they need to have protection from the world community. All religions should stand together with them. All peoples of good faith should stand together with them.
Yes.
They need to be saved, and we need to do it now. In fact, now is even too late for many.
Now, let's get back to Ms. Barrett on this. Ms. Barrett, would you see this also as part of a religious war or battle? Because I'd just like to bring in a comment, or a quote rather, by Aung San Suu Kyi when she was talking about the situation concerning the Muslim minority. She says there's a perception that Muslim power, global Muslim power, is very great, and certainly that's the perception in many parts of the world and in our country too. And that caused a lot of controversy, because people were saying, what kind of global Muslim power is she talking about, especially when it comes to the very small minority that exists in Myanmar?
Well, if there were any global Muslim power remotely comparable to, let's call it what it is, a tribal, nationalistic, Zionist, Jewish power around the world, I think that Myanmar already would have been bombed, invaded, and occupied to rescue these people if it had been Jews that were suffering what these Muslims in Myanmar are suffering. The fact is that Muslims around the world are probably the most disenfranchised people in terms of their per capita population of the world's population. Look at the UN. There's no serious Muslim representation on the Security Council. All kinds of anti-Muslim measures have been passed through there. We have Muslim Holy Land in Palestine that's been Muslimly administered Holy Land ever since Islam existed virtually, except for a couple of brief bloody crusader interludes. That has been the victim of another ethnic cleansing. This is, the greatest Islamic religious historical architectural monument in the world. The Dome on the Rock and the Masjid al-Aqsa is under occupation by radical, anti-Muslim, genocidal soldiers and colonists. So this notion that there's any Muslim power around the world threatening anybody is pretty ridiculous. Samuel Huntington said that Islam has bloody borders in the clash of civilizations, but what he failed to note is that in virtually every single case, it is the non-Muslim countries on the non-Muslim side of those borders that have invaded, occupied, plundered plundered and raped the Muslim countries because of the lack of Muslim power. So when Aung San Suu Kyi made this comment, especially with regards to this 2% of the population of Myanmar, these Rohingya Muslims who are impoverished, who've been brutally treated for decades in that country, who have ancestors who have lived there forever. The first census in 1800 showed that 1/3 of the Rakhine state was Muslim, and that's the same proportion today. There's no invasion of immigrants. This is all complete nonsense. It's mythology that's been invented by these hate-mongering racists. So yeah, this is really part of a global war on Islam that's being conducted around the world by various nefarious forces for their own purposes, to plunder Muslim resources, steal Muslim land, and that kind of genocidal, anti-Islamic ideology has penetrated other parts of the world and has encouraged forces in Myanmar to conduct this genocide. And so it is the responsibility of the governments that have launched this war on Islam, such as the United States government, which was complicit in the 9/11 false flag operation, which was designed to launch a multi-generational war on Islam all over the world. The U.S. government is responsible for the effects that this propaganda operation, this public relations stunt, as Lynn Margulis put it, created around the world, including this horrific genocide in Myanmar.
Yes, now, Mr. Peterson, let's look at this from the viewpoint of Islamophobia, the war on Islam, what a lot of people are calling the global war on Islam. Do you think that there is some blame to be put on the disinformation or misrepresentation of Islam and Muslims, allowing the Myanmar government to take this action on Islam? Because, as our guest was saying, they imagined those who were being persecuted were Jews and not Muslims. Would there be a similar response?
I'll part company with your guest and some of the more elaborate statements that were made, but it is simply not necessary to go there. It's simply not necessary to delve into the power of Islam hemispheres away. There is simply no power in a woman lying on her back being raped repeatedly by a complicit government that is endorsing these things and a world community that is turning their eyes away. There is no power in that woman. There's no power to the men being slaughtered wholesale or children being sold and slaughtered also. This doesn't represent power at all. There is certainly no threat at all to these people. They are not challenging the government. They are trying to define themselves and protect and defend their own lives. And the guilt that the world community should feel at this should be overwhelming. It has nothing to do about a threat of Islam to Myanmar, to Burma, to the region whatsoever. These are stateless people who are being grossly abused. Their human rights that belong to all of us, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, atheist, whatever. There is no power if you're lying on your back being raped, and that is what is happening to these people.
Mr. Peterson,
we are averting our eyes.
would you agree, however,
that is a moral outrage.
Mr. Peterson, would you agree, however, that
Yes.
the way that the media has been portraying Muslim and Islam has, affected the level of disregard that we're seeing by parts of the international community towards the plight of these Muslims?
I think it can be used as a thin tissue of an excuse, perhaps, but there is nothing behind the tissue. There is nothing behind the tissue. That is just one of many reasons that has been thrown out there. This is as much, from my perspective, ethnic cleansing as well as it is a religious cleansing. The arrogance of this and the complicity of 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners to avert their eyes and enable this human atrocity is an outrage. And I believe it has less to do with Islam than it has to do with economics, unfortunately. and the politics of the region. However, the thin tissue of Islam is being used as an excuse to cover these human atrocities, and that's got to be, that simply must be addressed. It is incorrect. There is no threat of Islam to the government, with 2% of the population in a minority ethnic community that is being cleansed. And I think we should get, it does the truth and it does resistance no benefit to attempt to justify the reasons that are being used for this by the government when they have nothing to do with the facts on the ground.
Well, Dr. Kevin Barrett, we're quickly running out of time. If you could also give us your viewpoints on this. I guess there, Mr. Peterson suggesting that it's not Islam, but it's more about the economic interests involved here when we're talking about the reasons behind this international disregard or, ignoring of this. Would you agree with that? Would you say that this is a thin tissue used as an excuse, to use the expression that Mr. Peterson used?
Well, unfortunately, I can't completely disagree with that. I think you found a guest that I can't really have a fiery, angry debate with, because I agree with most of what he's saying. Where's Lee Kaplan when we need him? But I think that, yes, there are economic factors driving this ethnic cleansing. There's people taking over the land vacated by the ethnic cleansing victims. And then there's also a sort of a nationalist ideology that Burmese, or this Myanmar government, is trying to unite the people of these 140 different ethnic groups in this country and imagine that they're one, imagined community, as Benedict Anderson would put it, based on scapegoating and expelling one of those 140 ethnic groups. So I don't think it is entirely about Islamophobia, but I think it is, there's a large element of Islamophobia here. And I think that, Islam was nominated to replace communism as the enemy du jour and the whipping boy after the end of the Cold War. This was a very carefully thought out, well-crafted plan by people like Bernard Lewis, Samuel Huntington, the neoconservative movement, and it's no accident that happened. It didn't, it's not just an accident that Islamophobia is rampant worldwide and being used to justify atrocities in Myanmar and so many other places. And I think the people responsible for spreading that Islamophobia around the world are responsible for what's happening in Myanmar. And I think we need to get to the root of this problem by getting to the root of this Islamophobia problem if we're going to solve not only the problem in Myanmar, but the problem in Palestine and problems elsewhere around the world. And I do hope that people like my guest in Washington, the other guest in Washington, and people in the U.S. government who are concerned about this particular problem will put two and two together and recognize that it is one symptom of a larger problem that is, if not completely linked to Islamophobia. It's being driven by this global Islamophobia that has been promulgated by neoconservatives here in the U.S.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kevin Barrett with the Muslim Jewish Christian Alliance with us there live from Madison. A big thank you to our guest in Washington as well, Mr. Frederick Peterson, Congressional Defense Policy Advisor. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us here on The Debate. From me, Homa Lesgi, it's goodbye.